You are listening to Cemetery Confessions, the world's #1 goth talk podcast.
And welcome back to Cemetery Confessions. On this episode, we are hanging out with Trevor of Nightbreed Recordings. Trevor is quite accomplished and well-known in the scene. He's a musician, first and foremost. Some of his bands include Death Party UK, Chaos Bleak, and the Angelfire project, but you probably know him more likely from Nightbreed Recordings, a label he started up in the early 90s, featuring Suspiria and 13 Candles, Athame, a whole bunch of other artists. He's been a lecturer at university, and he's been involved with and supporting the goth scene since the 80s. So on this episode, we're going to be hanging out to talk about, of course, the 80s and the 90s, his experiences, his perspective on the difference between, goth now, goth then. We'll hear some stories. We're going to talk about why the 90s were the most goth and why goth today is probably stronger than it ever actually has been. So I'm really excited to get to this interview. I am, as always, the Count. I am here with my co-host Trey, but let's get right into the episode. I assume you didn't come out of the womb running Nightbreed Records. So if you could talk a little about how you first got into goth, that would be wonderful.
Oh, how I first got into goth, or how I first set up Nightbreed. Okay, so we'll just do the goth thing first. I think really with the gothic rock, me coming into the gothic rock scene I've probably been involved with the scene since it started. I mean, I was always involved in underground music, really what you'd call punk rock and stuff from there. So it was like I was totally up with all the new bands that were coming out in England at the time, going out and seeing them, buying records, would have been CDs, records and stuff like that then. And the gothic scene I just naturally fell into it as it was evolving. And I remember reading this interview with Nick Fiend, and what he said about the gothic scene kind of sums up what I felt, is that I felt that when my hair was too long to be really acceptable in the punk rock scene. And I wasn't really into all the hippie drugs and stuff, even though I liked hippie music. That's what you call it, generically hippie music, countercultural music. So basically, right. I was kind of like too dark to be in the hippie scene and too long-haired to be in the the punk scene, and also what I really liked about the gothic scene right from the get-go is it's always been very, very female friendly. So back in the day, I mean, I go right back, I've been involved in music since the late 70s really, and you go out to clubs and stuff in those days, rock and metal and whatever things, and it'd be like 90% blokes, and there'd be about 10% women, and you'd all be fighting over them. And so the gothic scene, right from the very, very beginning, has always had a very strong female and feminine presence, and very positive female presence as well. And so I just thought, going back to what Nick Fiend was saying, is this was a scene that if I could sit down and say, I'm going to create a scene right now, and it's going to have bits of horror films in it, it's going to have bits of literature in it, it's going to have sort of like, the sort of kind of guitar sound that I like, etc., etc. If I could have invented a scene, it would have been the gothic scene. So I think that really one of the reasons why I'm so involved in the scene is and its perpetuation is because it was a scene that was almost crafted for me personally. Because if I could have sat down and invented a scene, that's what it would have been. I grew up on horror films and sci-fi films and literature and stuff like that. And, my first sort of serious music I really liked was stuff like Black Sabbath, which obviously, dark sort of look and stuff. And Hawkwind, which has got like a space sort of space rock sort of feel to it. And then, so I've always been attracted to the dark side and stuff. So it all kind of mixed together in a way that kind of worked for me.
I wanted to, just going off of that response, it's very cool. I wanted to say it's very cool that you have been involved in the goth scene and you're not just a label head, because it means I get to ask you these more interesting questions about goth. But also, I think it's important to recognize that one of the great things about Nightbreed is when people were supporting and do support Nightbreed, they know they're also supporting the scene because that's what, you're involved in. And so it kind of goes back into it, which I think is really important.
It's totally true.
But, I did want to ask, sort of following up to now, do you feel like you've stayed connected to goth and that it's resonated with you over the years, or have you have your taste changed over time?
No, I mean, for me, I am completely dedicated in its perpetuation, whether it's music that I create or I'm involved in or I support. So for me, it's like it still resonates with me just as much as it ever did because it's part and parcel. The norms and values of the Gothic scene are a part and parcel of my personal proclivities and motivations. So I don't see that I'm going to change anytime soon. And the scene has changed over the years. Certain things have kind of come in and out of inverted commas fashion, if you will. But intrinsically, I'm with it and always with it. And I think that at the moment, I think the Gothic scene for a number of years, probably since the turn of the century, started going a little bit quieter, even though it's always continued underground level. I feel at this moment in time in 2020, I don't know about America, but in the UK, there's a real resurgence of new bands or people who were in bands in the past with new bands and or basically setting up basically getting back together again and touring. So what we've got at the moment, we've got like kind of quite a strong underground grassroots movement that, in my honest opinion, is the strongest it's been for maybe 10, 15, 20 years.
I completely agree.
We're definitely seeing that over here in the States as well.
Oh, cool.
There's a good resurgence of, even like the death rock scene, which is the more American brand oftentimes.
Yeah.
Also has had its own revival. Well, we're on the tail end of that one, but definitely with the post-punk, goth, and
dark wave,
synth pop revivals, they're all sort of coming together.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting. I mean, I don't know if you guys know, but I'm actually doing a PhD in popular music and culture, and I've always been very, very interested totally interested in why music is important and how that relates to society and how individuals kind of relate to that. And one of the things that I predicted some years ago was that with the rise of technology, and obviously it's quite a glib thing to say, the rise of technology, but you've got on one hand, you've got CDR, you've got MP3s and WAVs and the way that you can file share on one hand. And on the other hand, you've got sort of relatively cheap recording packages so that you can turn your bedroom into a really good recording studio that produces music that's of extremely high quality. So we've got kind of multiple platforms of availability of music, such as Spotify and obviously Nightbreed Radio and other things like that. And then you've also got sort of the way that you can sort of distribute it, inverted commas, I make it available, and also sort of create it. So where I'm going with this is that once you've got all of this particular kind of technology available, what actually happens to the music paradigm that's been in place since at least the 1940s and 50s, where music was intrinsically commodified and sold to people, and so you've got an industry that's grown up to greater or lesser extent on the commodification of music. So we're in a position now in the 2020s where music really can't be commodified to any great extent anymore. But people, it's in their hearts to still play and enjoy and be involved in music. So what you've got is this kind of like paradigm clash where you've got sort of the availability and ability to create music and its value to, want of a better word, the tribe on one hand, and then you've got the remnants of the old music industry on the other that is still holding on to a particular commodified paradigm. And so I find that what's actually happening at the moment, I think I might be wrong, is that with the rise of, in the UK, and obviously you say in the States as well, of new bands and new talent, but on a very much underground level, is that in some respects, music is kind of returning to the tribe, because music's original sort of function in our society. And there's lots of arguments to say that one of the reasons why Homo sapiens are the most successful species of human being to exist is Homo sapiens had music, and music was a binder and a focus for the tribe. And so what's kind of possibly happening now is we've got kind of like lots and lots of small scenes and regional scenes and stuff all happening, maybe physically or also on the internet. And it's kind of like moving away from the commercial machine.
Yeah, no, I've been really liking that flowering, the democratization of music production and distribution has been a great liberating factor for all kinds of just the variety, the blossoming of the variety of music, where all individuals can now follow their passion instead of being beholden with the concept like, oh, I want to be a musician, so I need to go and see what's popular and cater to that. You don't need to do that anymore because you're not beholden to those labels who are beholden to the tastes of the populace. You can follow your passion. You can make your own, like you said, home studio, distribute it yourself in Bandcamp or Spotify or SoundCloud or whatever, and you'll find your audience. There's an audience for everything out there.
Yeah.
Will you be able to make a living off of it? Maybe, maybe not. But you can still make it. You can still use it as that vital element of a community and that communication that brings us back to that core element of human interaction.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think, for me, I've never wanted to do music for money. And I've never wanted to do music to be famous. It's something that I feel, it goes back to my first answer, is that the actual scene that I was involved in, I wanted to see it perpetuate, grow, blossom, develop, etc. So that is actually my focus. And so really at the moment, for the fact that I'd say 99% of people I know involved in the production of Gothic music, if not 100% of the people I know, are not making any kind of money of any description whatsoever. And quite a lot of people are making a loss. They're doing it for the sheer love of it, and the fact that, again, maybe they're motivated by the same things as myself, in that you want to kind of see the scene progress and move onwards. And so I think that, yeah, absolutely,
Do you feel like there's still a problem with, I guess the traditional narrative is that a lot of labels kind of shut down for a while because everyone expected to get free music. But there's also another, maybe the argument is that it's just a smaller scene. But do you feel like people torrenting music or not wanting to pay for music, that kind of thing, is still a problem within Goth?
I don't think it's necessarily a problem. I just think it's a new development. I mean, it's like, it's basically, I remember seeing once an episode of the Outer Limits, okay? And in this episode of the Outer Limits, somebody created cold water fusion. As soon as you create cold water fusion, that means you can create an atomic bomb in your kitchen with some tap water. And the idea that was put forward in this episode of the Outer Limits was that once something has been created or discovered, then it's kind of out there in the mind, even though the secret may not be shared. It's a bit like kind of once the certain elements are there, the understanding is there, then it'll continue to be created, and you can't stop it. And it's a bit like with what you say, torrenting and stuff like that. Is the technology exists? Obviously, large corporations have tried to stop it, but the fact of the matter is, you can't uninvent something once it's there, and there will always be a way around it. Now, obviously, in the past I've been a lecturer. I've lectured in popular music and culture and music technology, music performance. And if you talk to young kids and you say to them, when was the last time you bought anything? They look at you and gone out, because to them music is free, it's ephemeral, it's everywhere. And so it's just like, well, of course we can have it for nothing. So it's like kind of, I kind of, when I felt, obviously in the early days of Nightbreed, one of the reasons why we stopped with the physical label and everything else was because our break-even point, which is what we basically completely operated on a break-even, was thrown under by the invention of MP3s and CDR technology. And at first, I was kind of quite grumpy about it, but then I thought, well, that's technology, and like I say, I go back to the episode of Outer Limits, and you can't uninvent something once it exists.
Yeah, and even beyond that, just historically, when it comes to the production of music, I mean, music specifically, there's always been this contention between people wanting music and wanting to experience and participate in music, and the establishment who wants to commodify and sell it.
Yep.
I mean, even before recorded music, there was a whole outrage around sheet music and the pirating of sheet music, and people who transcribe music and then sing it at home without buying it from the official publishers, and then goes on to being able to make your own records, being able to record tapes, tape trading groups, CD burners, now MP3s and torrenting. And I think even beyond, you already mentioned the conversation with people, young people coming up in today's society, expecting music to be free. I don't necessarily think they view music as something that needs to be free, but it's not a commodity. It's not something you buy as an artifact that you can hold and use.
Right.
It's something that's available, hence the streaming side of things. And they don't have any problem paying for their Spotify or paying for their, SoundCloud Premium or whatever it is. They're fine paying for this service, but they want to have access to everything. They don't want to have to pick and choose at the store. What album do I really want to be able to listen to? I can't buy all of them. I want to have access to all this on a whim, and I'm fine paying a service fee to allow me entry into that world of music.
I mean, I don't know anybody that actually pays for Spotify at all, but I do, as in of my generation, but I know that younger kids do. I think my wife's son pays for Spotify. But I mean, I think the point you made about wanting everything available is absolutely correct. But I also think that in some respects, what we see with the use of new technology and interaction with music is the death of the album. In that, obviously, I'm of a certain age where I bought records, albums, and buying an album, it was like visually, sort of attractive, or at least that was the idea. The album, the actual artwork on the cover, it usually chimed with something that was personal to you, so you felt a connection with it, and that's why you bought it. Half times, I don't know about you guys, but half the time, when I was younger, I'd buy an album just to like the cover, and then hope to like the music, and so what happened is that you'd get this album and you take it home, and the whole vinyl experience, that's and then obviously a variant of that happened with the CD revolution, is in that you could put more music on it, et cetera, but it's still an album experience, a collection of ideas, a document in time. Now what you've got is that every single song that you release has to be like a single. And so in some respects, we've got like kind of a cultural return to the single. And I actually personally am, I'm into albums and the whole experience, but I do understand why the single or individual tracks have become important. I mean, particularly with the rise of social media, where, as in Chaos Bleak, we get a lot of emails from people saying, when are you going to do a full-length album? And the fact of the matter is, there's no point us doing that full-length album, because, I've been in bands in the past, and Midnight Configuration, for example, I kind of would spend 2 years writing and recording an album, and it would take a lot of time and money, and I'd put it out, and then like 3 weeks later, social media would say, okay, what do you got new? I'm thinking, well, I've just done this album, it's took 2 bloody years to do it. So these days, with all of the musical projects I've got going, which is like kind of Death Party UK, the Angelfire project, and the most visual of the moment is Chaos Bleak, is that we're not interested in releasing albums, because it's like, you kind of put all your eggs in one basket, and then that's it. And, people forget about you. I mean, the things with social media, if you don't post like virtually every day or every couple of days, you've forgotten, mate, And so I think that, I think obviously society's changing. And going back to the original about the Gothic scene, I think the Gothic scene is changing. And one of the things about the Gothic scene is that it's always been very adaptable to technology and to social trends. Contrary to detractors of the Gothic scene, so you're living in the past, blah, blah, blah. The Gothic scene, in my opinion, has always embraced new technology. Has nearly always been there before everybody else. which is possibly one of the reasons why the Gothic scene perpetuates itself, in that it actually remembers where it comes from, but also moves with the times.
I have been hearing that more and more from other artists and people in the music scene about how there is that same expectation we were talking about of releasing singles and EPs rather than full length albums. But kind of going off of that issue, for me, and I know a lot of people back in the day, music samplers were a cornerstone of the scene.
Yeah,
and we can just reference Nightbreed comps, and actually this came up in the Discord that we have for Patreon members for the podcast. A few people mentioned that for them, and a lot of people in the UK, the New Dark Alternatives comps were really, really important. So I'm wondering, do you feel the same as with albums? Do you think like the art of the compilation has been lost now?
Yes. Simple answer. I think that, the whole, for me, obviously, that as Nightbreed released several series of compilations. We did the New Alternative series, and we did the Gothic Sounds of Nightbreed series, and we tried to get another series going called Carnival of Souls, which was going to be bands that played the Carnival of Souls, but we only got to like one edition. But I think that, before I did the CDs, I did like loads of tape compilations as well, which were based on the idea of alternatives, alternative world, alternative England, something alternative this way comes, etc. And the whole reason for me to release compilations was to introduce people to new music. And I used to make the CDs pretty cheap, so people would kind of chance, $5 or a $10 or something on an album, and if they liked about half the tracks, then it's a winner. And so I found, particularly with the Gothic Sounds of Nightbreed series, because we sold them at pretty much cost price, it really did a lot to actually promote the bands that were on the bands and the label, really. The most successful of the Nightbreed compilations was the Gothic Sounds of Nightbreed Volume 1. And we because it was so cheap, we sold it at like cost price. And we managed to get it into loads of different distributors back in the day. So it got out got out everywhere. And I think that, so going back to, as the art of the compilation been lost? Well, yeah, because what's actually happened is back in those days, when I did the compilations, you couldn't read about the bands that was on the compilations in the establishment rock music press. There wasn't, the fanzines were cool and existed, but they couldn't reach past a certain point. The internet was either not existent or in its early days. So the only way you discovered new bands was by taking a chance on a compilation. And these days we've got the internet. So if somebody wants to find out something about, I don't know, Dark Side Cowboys, for example, they literally jump on the internet, Google them, and within 30 seconds they've got, they've heard everything they've got, either via streaming or whatever. Whereas, back in the day when I was doing Nightbreed and stuff, you get one track and then people will say, yeah, that's fantastic, and then they go out and chase down the band's music. And I think that one of the things I'm most proud about with what Nightbreed did was that the effectiveness of the compilation albums that we did. And I think obviously other labels did similar things. There was the Deal on Fortune samplers, which I thought were really, really good. And there was a lot of samplers that came out of Hyperion in the day. And then there was obviously Mick Mercer's Hex Files and stuff like that. And they were all a really, really great way of introducing people to new music. But yeah, mate, I think the art of the compilation is gone. The last compilation I released was the Gothic Sounds of Nightbreed 5. And that was, must be getting over 10 years ago now. And even though I think it was a great compilation, it didn't, and I've still got boxes and boxes left, because by then people were just going on the internet and grabbing stuff for free. So that was that, really. So yeah, sadly, yeah.
So I kind of disagree on that. I think the compilation album is gone, and from a label standpoint, I can see why that would be gone. But when I go to like music review sites or music discovery types things, if I'm looking at a reviewer and they're doing a best of and they list a bunch of things, or I'm going to a Spotify or SoundCloud, there's a lot of emphasis now put into a curated playlist, which is, I think, the modern incarnation of the compilation. Is you discover new music by getting that, here's a Spotify playlist of, Darkwave, best Darkwave of 2010. So I think the Spotify playlist and just other streaming services, those curated playlists are the modern day incarnation of the compilation.
You're right. Yeah. I've got a couple. I don't know if you've seen my stuff on Spotify. I've kind of twigged on that. The basically the modern version of the Gothic sounds of Nightbreed are the curated playlists. And obviously, I've created like kind of the new Gothic Underground playlist, as well as a best of Gothic sounds of Nightbreed, etc. And I think that you're right. That is the new version of it. But I think as a physical CD compilation, the art has definitely gone.
Right, but I think that's just the physical media itself just kind of dying in and of itself, other than the people who just want to hold an artifact. People are devoted to this digital streaming paradigm.
Going back to that idea of, talking about just trying to break even and selling things at cost, I think a lot of that was, and you even mentioned this, sort of the passion of wanting to be involved in the community, having that DIY ethos. So I guess this is kind of a two-part question, but do you feel like, first of all, that DIY ethos is still relevant to people in the scene today? And then secondly, do you have any advice for people trying to balance doing this kind of stuff, which is real work, right? Because you're not hiring an accountant and a promoter and a marketer and that kind of stuff, right? But trying to balance doing all of those responsibilities and, a day job or a family or whatever.
Yes, mate. I'm there. Basically, to the first part of your question, do I think the DIY ethic is strong? Yes, because obviously we've seen in the UK the rise of the new Gothic Underground, and even though it's a far smaller sort of rise than previous sort of ebbs and flows in the Gothic scene, and certainly it's a long way from the mainstream. As I think that the DIY ethic is actually stronger now than it has been for many years, because I think that going back in the day, I've been involved in what you'd refer to as the DIY ethic in music since probably the early 80s. And even back then, there was always a lot of people used to hold out a secret hope that maybe it would just be me. Maybe I'll be the one that will get that big record contract. Maybe it's me. I'm doing things myself and it's all cool. But maybe, the finger of the corporate god will point at me and say, it's going to be you. You're going to be successful. So I think that these days, because in the Gothic scene, there is no chance of that ever. Then I think the people involved in the scene now, who are actually like kind of creators and whatever else, I think that they are more dedicated to DIY ethic, because there is no chance in a million that they're going to break into the mainstream, because that whole concept, in my opinion, is changing because of society's changing. And so, moving on from that, so the second part of the question, the question that you have to ask yourself, if you are a musician or a DJ or something involved in what is intrinsically a fairly small, even though it's a global subculture. I hate the term subculture, but I use it. Then you have to say, well, okay, why do I do this? Why is it important to me, and what do I get from it? Now, if you do it because, like I said earlier on in this interview, because it's part of what you're about as part of your personality, then really it's like breathing. It's not any kind of, and you said about balancing a day job. For example, if you were into like quad biking, you'd find time to do quad biking, and it's something that's part of who you are. My friend Martin from Attrition, he once said to me that being involved in music is almost like a religious calling. It's like something it's you have to do this. And for me, I can't speak for anybody else, but it's like creating music is part of who I am. And I create a lot of music at the moment. So I've got 3 different musical projects going. I'm writing different, amounts and different styles all the time. And I think that really, we've all got tough jobs. I've got pretty busy freelance work, and I'm also studying for a PhD and everything else. And I try and balance everything up. But music is my joy. And the music that I create and the scene that I'm involved in is my joy. So my joy is part of who I am. So I don't see any problem with me ending anytime soon, unless it's an awful accident or something like that.
Yeah. No, that was beautifully put. I wholeheartedly agree with that. Let's go back up here then. So Nightbreed, one of the special things about Nightbreed as an entity, I think, is that it's synonymous with a sound similar to, and maybe you can speak to this in a second here, but sort of like if you say 4AD or Project Records, it evokes a time and a place and a sound. But I think more than that, Nightbreed was different because you branched out in so many different arenas, and it kind of also became synonymous with an ethos and a tribe of people. And so I was hoping you could kind of explain those and kind of speak to that.
I think really, firstly, the Nightbreed. I mean, I'm almost talking in the second person. It's like I created Nightbreed, so it's kind of my ideas really. But I mean, the Nightbreed concept was to always never forget where you've come from and pay homage to that, but don't keep looking back. Move forward and embrace new ideas, but don't forget who you are. And I think really that is Nightbreed's essence in its most simplistic form. I'm moving on from that. It's like support new bands, support the bands that that are close to you, whether it's physically close to you or close to you via the internet. The people that became attracted to and worked with Nightbreed all shared that view, and so that's why we kind of. But the other thing, how we got the sound was that. Very early on in Nightbreed's sort of evolution, Mark Tansley, who later formed Suspiria, he became my business partner, and he was a lot more technically able than I was at that time. And long story short, is that we decided to create our own recording studio because it was cheaper in the long run to actually spend a few thousand to build a studio rather than thousands of pounds per album, And so what we did is that Mark created a recording studio, and over the years it evolved, it changed and stuff like that. And what is the kind of the most recent version of that studio is in my house right now. Obviously, over the years you replace bits and pieces of equipment and whatever and progressed. But I think the Nightbreed sound came about because of Suspiria and the attitude that we had towards embracing technology to improve, your sound. And also, one of the things was, and I want to talk about this, is that in the UK back in the Nightbreed days of the early to mid 90s, you couldn't get your music played on the radio. You couldn't get your music reviewed anywhere outside of fanzines. The only way that you could get your music played was at goth clubs, and people at goth clubs want to dance. So if you make your music danceable, even if people don't know it, when you slip it on, when you DJ, I mean, we'd be DJing and we'd be either playing something, this, that, and the other, and then we'd sneak in a Suspiria track or a Merry Thoughts track or something like that, and people would just carry on dancing because of the groove. So the Nightbreed sound was in part because of the techniques that I kind of learned from, and we all learned from Mark Tansley, and he learned in turn from a guy called Carl Younger, who was a producer of all the early Suspiria stuff, most notably Drama. And also the fact that if you want people to like your music, the only avenue you got was clubs, and it had to be dancey. So that's why the kind of dancey element came into it. So I think really that's where that sound came from. The ethos came from the fact that we wanted to never forget where we came from, but wanted to move on. And I think one of the things, I just want to reiterate that a little bit more, in that a lot of organizations and stuff, they'll start at point A and then they'll move to point Z, and then they'll forget, or they'll they'll kind of try to hide some stuff they did in the past, or they will say that, oh yeah, we've moved on from that, we're not like that anymore. Nightbreed, we've never been like that. We say, yes, that's what we did, and that was good, but now this is now what we're doing, and there's a definite bone of connection between one thing and the other. And so to this day, even though Nightbreed now is just mainly digital and limited CD releases of mainly the stuff that I'm involved in, Nightbreed Radio is still going, and the ethos is still out there.
Yeah, I think your, and there's a question I want to ask you specifically because of this, but I think your general position on the looking forward and what we can do in the future is, in my experience, a lot of the people I've talked to You know what? Actually, not the people I've talked to, because the people I've talked to generally are of the position that you and I are, where we're more interested in looking forward rather than staying stuck in the 80s or 90s. But I do see a lot of people that are older and only care about the 80s or 90s. A lot of what I see is either, either the 90s was when goth truly started, or the 90s were just like a pale imitation of the 80s kind of thing, but they only care about those bands. And, I feel like you have a more unique perspective, but considering that you lived it and now, still are interested in looking towards doing new things, do you feel like goth is still kind of stuck only caring about the 80s and 90s?
Okay, right. There's a whole load of things there. First up, I personally think that, I've done many interviews about this, but I believe that really goth only really started in the 1990s. And I wrote about this in some length for my master's dissertation, which, by the way, is going to be split into 2 papers, which are going to be available soon. That's another story.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah, I'll tell you when it comes out. It'll be a few months. Yeah.
Awesome.
So first off, I personally think that goth only really started proper in the 90s, because in the 1990s, without really going on for hours and hours and hours, what actually happened is the scene was deliberately attacked at the end of the 80s, going into the early 90s, by the UK mass media and mainstream commoditative forces. And they basically wanted to rip it down for a whole load of different reasons. And they wanted to destroy the scene. So if you if you said you were goth, you might as well say, I'm an idiot. Basically that's really what they were saying. Or you're uncool, you're this, you're that, and basically all the mainstream press and all the mainstream media all jumped on the bandwagon, and it became. And in this country, goths were openly laughed at in the streets. There was abuse. All sorts of stuff happened indirectly because of this whole wave of let's destroy the gothic scene attitude, which came from the mainstream media and commoditative forces, for reasons that I could bore you with for about 5 hours, which I won't do, mate, so don't worry. So what happened is that in the 1990s, you had, very simply put in my mind, you had a marooned generation, a generation that really liked the music of the 80s and late 80s and stuff like that, gothic rock or proto-gothic rock, whatever you want to call it, but a lot of people say was gothic rock, but the music of the 80s, and they wanted more of the same, and they wanted the culture to continue, but they felt completely isolated and marooned because they were cut off from all of the establishment music magazines, etc., 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 and they were like a lost generation, And so I came along with Nightbreed, and I sold CDs on the back of a little review I'd write of each CD, and people would buy them. And long story short, what really happened in the 1990s is the idea of goth became owned. It became, the people involved in the scene said, yes, I am, and fuck you. This is our scene and we like it. We like this music. It's ours. Whereas before that, the gothic scene was really like semi-mainstream and part of the, it was part of the musical landscape as, say, punk rock or acid house or something like that. But it was only sort of at the end of the 80s and into the 90s that the gothic scene in the UK, I think the same thing happened in America, I'm not sure, but it became isolated. And so therefore, once the scene becomes owned by the people involved in it, then it becomes actual. It's not quite the same, but it's a bit like kind of gays owning the word gay. It's like saying, this is yeah, okay, you call it, that's an insult to you, but to us it's not, it's who we are. And so the gothic culture is similar to that. So so for me, I think that the gothic scene started proper in the 1990s. I'm not going to denigrate any of the great, great, great work that was done in the 80s, but I think as a notion or a concept or a tribe, the gothic scene started in the 1990s. The other bit of the question you're asking me about is about how people only want to look to the past. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So my view on that is I understand why people do that. The reason why people, because you tend to find that I mean, I'm kind of in my late 50s now. And so a lot of people in the Gothic scene are younger than me, my age, or roughly my generation. And they look back to their youth with a lot of fondness. And the music of their youth, they hold with incredible fondness. Now, we have a phenomena in the UK, and I bet it's the same in America. And it hasn't got a name, but I'm going to give it a name. I call it The Returned. Have you ever seen the TV program The Returned, where people kind of come back? It's a bit like that in the UK, in that people who were involved in the proto-Gothic scene, the Gothic scene in the 80s, they get married, they have kids, and they drift out away from the scene. The kids grow up, and the parents, the kids leave home, or not, the case may be, and they kind of, or at least they reach a certain age where the parents think, do you know what? What's happening in the Gothic scene? So they turn their eyes towards the stuff that's on the internet. And obviously, those of us who were involved in the 90s kept things going the entire time. And they look back at it and think, fantastic, wonderful, let's start going to those nights. And obviously, what they do is they bring that cultural baggage from the 1980s, as in, like, let's make it the 80s again. Sort of cultural norms and values that get sort of spread out in the scene. So what we've got, I understand why they do that, and say that the 90s, yes, I am a fan of the 90s, but I also believe in supporting the music now, because I think that, yeah, great stuff was done in the 90s. The big difference between the 80s and the 90s is because the 90s bands were all on independent underground labels, and so therefore their digital footprint isn't as pervasive as, say, the music from the 80s, because the music from the 80s, the bands were signed to big record labels with big budgets, big video budgets, and so they left a far greater digital footprint. So you've got the digital footprint thing going on, you've got the return thing going on as well. And for me, I think that really that that stuff that's happening now is as good as the 90s, but in a different way. So, but I can understand why people become intrinsically generationalized. They become stuck in a particular mindset. I understand that. It's easy for that to happen. But I think that really is the Gothic scene password looking. I'll speak about the UK scene. The UK scene is basically, very simply put, two scenes. You've got those that go to events and just want to dance around to Sisters of Mercy again, and those that want to support the new bands that are coming out. Now, those who support the new bands coming out are actually the minority. That you go to the big goth events, the floors will fill if people play First and Last and Always or something like that. Whereas if somebody plays something like, I don't know, something more modern, the floors will empty. Something like Merciful Nuns or something, in the UK at least, which is a shame because I think they're a great band. And then we've got some very young kids coming to Gothic nights now, 18, 19, 20. But they view it all as a nostalgia thing. So it's kind of like there is, inverted commas, new blood coming into the scene, but it's coming into the scene as a nostalgia thing. And so you do, you do see, depending on the event, there are some very, very well-established nights in the UK that always pull quite big crowds. And in those crowds, the general demographic, I would say, is middle-aged. But you do get some younger people there as well. So it's there, but annoyingly for me, the scene seems to be, it exists quite a lot on the internet now. You've got, if you want goth, you've got it on the internet, really. And a lot of people just interact with it vicariously from that position. So I think it's kind of, a mixture of things.
Trey, did you want to follow up on any of that, or I'll move on?
No, not really. I mean, there's a lot of things that I just agree with and I could reiterate, but that's not adding a lot of value there. So cool. We can just move along.
So I guess the next question then was, I feel like I've heard you talk about this in the past, but this idea, well, the question generally is, do you feel like it's less dangerous to be goth now than it was in the 90s? Yeah.
I think it is. I think it's less dangerous to be goth now than at any time. I think that generally society has become a lot more tolerant, which is ironic, really, because there is obviously the odd explosion of stuff. I mean, weirdly enough, today, my wife and I, doing very householdy things, we've just taken some stuff to the local tip. And one of the guys working there just said to me, because when was the last time you had your hair cut? And I looked round at him and I said, 1981. When was the last time you went to the dentist and had your teeth fixed? Because, I think cheeky bastard, But that was, to be honest with you, that's unusual. That's really unusual now. I mean, once upon a time, I used to get stuff all the time. Back in the 80s, when I was young and pretty, I used to wear makeup during the day, just walking around the shops all the time. And you'd get, this, that, you'd get comments, you'd get abuse, you'd get people. I mean, I remember one time when I was with Tony, the old drummer from Every New Dead Ghost, we were walking through a shop in Derby, and this guy just went up and punched Tony straight in the mouth, bang, on the floor, on the deck, and that was back in just for the way he looked. I mean, Tony did wear more makeup than I did. I mean, and also I remember times, back in the 80s, there was three of us. We went to a pub in Nottingham, and I had some makeup on. My mate had no makeup on at all because he wasn't into that. Another one of my mates, he had like the full look, and the guy behind the bar pointed to my mate who looked normal. He says, "I will serve you," and then he pointed to me. He goes, "I will serve you." Then he pointed to my mate who had tons of makeup on. He goes, "But I will not serve that." Wow. And so we kind of left immediately. But also I had a similar shit back in the 80s again. People refusing to serve you in bars because the way you looked, and stuff like that. And in the 90s, it kind of carried on a little bit. But to be fair, I'm probably completely oblivious to it now. I mean, mate, I'm nearly 60 years old, and I've looked like this since at least the early 80s. And I'm just completely used to it. I mean, I think when you sent me the written questions, I think you asked me about how has my appearance helped or hindered me. Am I correct in assuming that?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, I've actually got something to say about that, and it's positive. I find that, it's actually both positive and negative. First, the positives. With what I do now, I work as a freelancer for an examination board to do with music. And I also in the past have been a lecturer, and I actually found that my appearance has actually added legitimacy to my involvement within music. In that, I look the part, and so therefore I'm more considered. And in the past, students have possibly took me more seriously because I look like I should in regards. The involvement of musical subcultures or whatever. I mean, despite the fact they say I look like Ozzy Osbourne sometimes, but bless them. So it kind of, I find that actually my appearance works in my favour because on one hand, people say, well, actually, you're talking about being in bands and doing stuff. You've done it, obviously, and, you're still doing it. So therefore, what you say has a certain amount of legitimate weight. Also, on top of that, I find that sometimes when you're dealing with schools and stuff like that, I turn up and I look the way I do. I look pretty much the way I do now when I go out. You go out to working at schools and stuff. And at first, sometimes you find that they look at you as if to say, "Oh, what's he all about?" And then I start talking, and I think it kind of shocks them that I actually am pretty eloquent and I do know what I'm talking about. So it's actually been a massive. It's kind of like been an asset looking the way I do. The only way it's kind of held me back is dealing with certain kinds of high-end corporate businessmen and certain organizations where they just think, yeah, okay, Trev, you look cool and all that, or not, as the case may be, but toe the party line. So, and so I think that you do tend to, so I think this kind of worked for me and worked against me in equal amounts.
Yeah, I think that's in general just what, having any sort of an alternative look or a look that diverges significantly from the mainstream tends to do is it makes that initial entry into the door harder because people just see you and jump to conclusions, go, okay, you aren't one of us, you don't belong here, you're a problem. But it also makes your acceptance that much more powerful when you do prove that you know what you're talking about, you prove that you've had those experiences or you can speak to things. People go, all right, now this person doesn't toe the norm, so I'm not being fooled by them being prettier or fitting some sort of mold. they've won me over by their actual knowledge, their ability, their communication skills. And so I now respect you even more than I would someone who just got the pass initially because they looked the part.
Yes, mate. Absolutely. And that's why I found it to be, like I say, I found it, to be more of an asset than a problem, really. I mean, actually, there was another incident, again, just recently. I was on the tube, the trams, and a load of kind of kids, probably no more than about 14 or 15, sort of surround. I was actually having a bit of a nap because I'd just been working, and they surrounded me, and they kind of woke me up and started going on about, taking a piss out my hair, taking a piss out this, that, and the other. And I just sort of, gave them as good as I got. And I was quite shocked at 14-year-olds being so xenophobic. And I told them so. And they kept going on about that I was gay because I had eye makeup on, I was this, that, and the other. And I said, mate, this says more about you than it says about me. It doesn't matter if I've got makeup on. It doesn't matter if I'm gay. It doesn't matter. The fact that you find it a problem means that you've got a problem, which means you're hiding something, son.
Yeah.
But eventually left me alone.
That always shocks me when I run into younger people that are transphobic or homophobic or whatever. It's like, what year is it? Like, what?
Yeah, I think the things that are shocked, because going back to the early part of this question, is actually we live in a more tolerant world now, and so when you do see aspects of prejudice, small-mindedness, and intolerance and xenophobia, it's all the more shocking.
So, do you feel now that I guess in the 80s and 90s, it was more apparent how goth was socially transgressive and politically transgressive. Do you think that we still kind of carry on that legacy, or does transgression have less to do with what it means to be goth now?
I think that back in the 80s, I don't think anybody sat down and thought, I'm going to be a real rebel and shock everybody and make, I don't think they ever thought about that. I think they just went with it. And I think that really that legacy has continued in the scene, is that people do stuff because they feel it's aesthetically and intrinsically part of who they are. They don't set out necessarily to, look how weird I am. Look how weird I am. It's like kind of, I have known people like that, to be fair. They tend to dip in and out the scene and they're gone. And so I think that the Gothic look in the UK has definitely got milder as the years gone by. But I think it's because most people are older. But I think that it's not as, rebellious and transgressive as it might have been perceived once. But I don't think it was even deliberately, intended to be rebellious then. It was just an existential aspect of that person's personality, and I think that I'm all for that. I think that, as Crowley says, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. You should be true to your own self. And if you feel like walking around wearing a dress, then good luck to you, mate. So I don't see the Gothic scene as being rebellious. I just see it as being who I am and who other people are, and effectively being an example of truth rather than as an example of rebellion and, bohemian sort of, I don't know, but rebellion. I don't see it like that. I don't see the Gothic scene as being rebellion. I just see it as being normal. For me, that's normal.
Yeah, I guess I would say it's subversion and rebellion and transgression are part of what it means to exist as a goth, because it's an alternative way of being in the world to what most people expect. But I don't think that if you want to get into defining goth or kind of breaking that down, I don't think that the culture is built on, okay, how do we do the opposite of what everyone else is doing?
How
weird
can we be?
Right.
I think a key distinction that needs to be made, because this I guess the same conversation happens a lot with, oh, you're so transgressive, you're just being transgressive, you're just being subversive. And, if everybody wore black, you'd start wearing pink or something like that, just so you see keeping transgressive. And I think the core of that sort of Gothic subculture and the subversion, the transgressive nature of it, it's not I'm being transgressive. It's I am willing to be transgressive. I am able to express myself and willing to to cross that line when I feel it meets, when I'm expressing myself. I'm not cultivating myself in response to you, because I don't care what you do. I don't care what you think.
Yeah.
I don't care what you feel. But I'm also, again, I don't care what you think or feel, so I'm not going to toe that line either. I'm going to do what I do. I'm willing to be transgressive, but it's not for the end of being transgressive. It's just because I'm being me.
Yeah. That's fair enough. I think, that's me. I mean, I could say go right back. I mean, the Gothic scene it's just who I am. And before the term goth was coined, I was still that same person, attracted to the same things. I wore black as soon as I could start buying my own clothes. Even in hippie days, and I did wear, the stuff back in the day. I always went back to black because that was who I was. And if the whole world wore black, I would still carry on wearing the same stuff as I've always done.
So now that we're coming up on about an hour here, I think my kind of final question here, just purely out of curiosity, because this is something that Trey and I have gone back and forth about over the last few years. And it's this question of, considering that you have studied music theory to some extent, I'm sure you can speak to that. But in general, how useful do you find genre classification as a construct? And then secondarily to that, how do we understand the connection between bands that on the face of it seem to be very disparate when you're going from Cocteau Twins to Christian Death or Dead Can Dance to Bauhaus, right? How do we, musicologically, how does that make any sense?
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, I actually do find genre and subgenre constructs extremely helpful. I think it's because I'm dyslexic, you see, and I like to try to understand the world, and I find it quite difficult because I'm also slightly on the spectrum. So for me, I like to for example, I like to analyze the absolute meaning of words. Semantics and semiotics, thankfully, are actually part of my hobby, but also obviously figure in with my PhD work. And so that naturally moves over into understanding different effects of music, different subgenres, and, as you say, classifications. And I find it really helpful because if you can put them into little boxes, as much as certain people don't like that, and I can completely understand why, and I'm sympathetic why. I mean, like, the argument would be, why could you put me in a box? I'm just me. I get that, whatever. But for me, I find it very, very helpful because I want to see where things have come from and where they're going to go. It's a bit like building a wall using different bricks of different musical constructs and different genre constructs. And I like to see how everything's built together. So the next question I think you're asking was what is the bone of connectivity between all those disparate bands that you mentioned? I mean, I think the bands that you mentioned, I think really you need to kind of analyze them in some depth. And again, it's open to interpretation. But I'd say that what unites all of those particular bands that you mentioned is the intentionality of their music to produce certain kinds of dark emotional effects, and how they do it, using particular musical forms. I mean, the bands that you mentioned, it would be, obviously different kinds of bass and delay and effects and whatever. And I think that really that's what the bone of connectivity between them all is, and possibly also lyrical traditions. And one of the things I would say about all of those bands is the avoidance of any kind of pentatonic scales or any kind of solos that embrace the pentatonic system. I mean, I think the one kind of Gothic music that does, to a greater or lesser extent, use the pentatonics would be death rock and stuff that is close to that particular thing. I mean, bands like the Gun Club, for example, have got, obviously they've got lots of pentatonic stuff going off, as well as all kinds of, American swampy influences. And I really like that. I'm actually a big fan of the Gun Club. But I think that really you say, well, okay, so you've got kind of bands that embrace pentatonics and don't embrace pentatonics. So, but the bands you mentioned, I think generally you could say that they avoid the guitar solo and the all of the culture that comes with the rockiest guitar solo. However, there are many other bands that do actually involve that. I mean, bands like Catherine's Cathedral, for example, they do have a lot of songs where they have extended guitar solos, which is great. I really like that. But they have other aspects of the Gothic aesthetic to a greater or lesser extent, which brings it part and parcel into that particular set of genres. I mean, and the final point I'd like to make about this is that every now and again you come across artists who say, I am Gothic. And, you listen to their music and, you say, well, yeah, no, maybe, whatever. However, if they feel it's Gothic, who are we to tell them that they're not?
Well, I think I think part of that, like I don't really have time to go into this, but
that's a whole other episode.
Yeah. Actually, and I was considering that. I was thinking there's so many more directions we could have more of a protracted academic conversation. We could talk more specifically about music. So I think we're gonna have to try and get you back on the show at some point in the future.
Would
go in
be
a few
my
different
pleasure,
directions.
mate.
Absolutely awesome, fantastic. So, well, I guess let's wrap it up there. Trey, unless there's anything you wanted to throw in.
I just wanted to make a bit of a point on the second part of your question regarding, because I know I've made that. I don't know if you just got that list of bands, but I know I've made that similar argument.
That was directly from what you've said before. Yes.
Yeah. So the way I kind of distinguish those is I don't consider all those bands to be goth from a genre standpoint.
Yeah.
Musically speaking, they aren't all part of the same genre. Every one of those bands is actually a different genre. Some are closer and farther from each other in the genre family tree, the taxonomy, however. But there's a difference between bands that are part of the goth genre and bands that are considered members of the gothic subculture. The goth subculture, bands that would be appealing to people part of the subculture, because the subculture is a fan of more than just a very narrow goth genre, even when it comes to music. There's a range of music that people in the goth subculture are interested in, and those do, as you were saying, Trev, about the lyrical and musical concept, the emotions that are brought up, and that's why we can like music from all different genres, even ones that aren't typically considered goth. But I like this song because this song by, whatever, Taylor Swift might have a sort of gothic bent to it, and you could like just this one song because it adds to those emotions.
Yeah.
Even though that's a pop band, whatever. So we can like music from all different genres. There are certain bands, certain genres that definitely hold to that sound, hold to that emotional content, hold to that lyrical content more closely. And those are the bands that we embrace as a whole, rather than, oh yeah, I like that one song by that person. But I think that's the main distinction, is it's outside of a genre of music. It is more the aesthetic, the appreciation of the subculture itself.
Yeah. And I do think a big piece of that is, and I also personally, I do enjoy sort of taxonomizing and understanding the semiotic and semantic parts of that, and but a big part of that I do think is that genre. These are constructions that we create, and so there is some aspect of fluidity to them. And I think part of what what goth culture and understanding goth music is dialectical, and that it's this discourse between the members of the community over time that kind of reassess and create and construct and agree upon and debate what is and isn't goth music. And even I think even sort of the goth canon, as you could say it, of what are the original goth albums is still up for debate, and people can argue and discuss those things. And I think that's part of what makes goth interesting.
Yeah, totally. I mean, interesting you mentioned dialectics. I mean, that's one of the actual sort of mechanisms that I employ in my writing and my research. And I believe most strongly that to understand not just the Gothic scene, but any kind of musical scene or any kind of art scene, is to see it from a completely, dialectical standpoint. And I argue in both my masters and the work I'm doing with my PhD in a dialectical structure in understanding, as you say, the fluidity and the development of music. I mean, from a very simple point is that time is like a river and dialectics is like a river, and you never step in the same river twice, but it also contains its rhythmness, and I think that really that is, you're absolutely right. The debate as which is the best goth album of all time, etc., is always open to debate, and as you say, I completely agree with you. It's what makes it interesting.
Beautiful. I'm very much looking forward to reading your work. If you want to keep me updated on that at some point, or
no worries,
we'll see
mate.
if we can get you back on as well. So beautiful. Thank you so much for your time. Let's please tell myself and the listeners where you would like them to go to find all of your projects, and I'll make sure I have those linked in the show notes for this episode.
Okay, so I suppose really that these days the best way to actually find out all the stuff that I'm involved in is to go by Facebook. So my post-punk gothic band is Chaos Bleak. We've got a single out the other day, so you can go onto Facebook or Bandcamp, and you can find obviously if you want to buy this stuff, the digital downloads and get them from Bandcamp. And we've got one mini album out called Transcendental Chaos, and we've got loads of videos available on Facebook. Same with Death Party UK. We've got a couple of CDs out, limited edition, which you can get from Bandcamp, and find us on Facebook. And finally, my prog gothic project, the Angelfire project. So far, no CDs has come out, but I've released 4 extended pieces of music, which you can watch the videos for on Facebook. And again, want to catch up with Nightbreed. Nightbreed and Nightbreed Radio is on Facebook. Just Google it, you'll find it. But also, we've got websites. There's www.nightbreedrecordings.org, which is the main go-to site for all of the historic Nightbreed information, images, etc., etc. And then we've also got www.nightbreedradio.com, which is the main broadcast site for Nightbreed Radio. There's a little player, you click on it, and you can hear the live feed. I think that's about it, mate. Yeah, that's all of my main places to find me.
I have historically and have continued to listen to Nightbreed Radio, but I've been listening for the past month, basically all day at work while, leading up to the interview. And it is lovely to kind of, for me, it's kind of a nostalgia trip because I used to really be into like Shoutcast and internet radio and kind of that kind of thing. So it's very cool to get that curated kind of playlist that you won't get unless you go to a club or something like that. So
yeah, totally.
Trev, thank you again so much for coming on to the show to chat with us. It was truly a pleasure to have you on. We're going to get out of here for this week. Before I go, though, I wanted to let you know about what we have coming up on the next episode. Of course, if you would like to get more content similar to this, you can head over to patreon.com/cemeteryconfessions. The most recent stuff I've uploaded includes exclusive videos. I did one about the philosophy of punishment, and I was talking about the recent reducing of the sentence for Sophie Lancaster's killer. I did a vlog episode about my trip to Nocturna here in Chicago. I did a video about the use of the singular they and sort of a look at etymology and the construction of language. And we've got other stuff coming up as well. I just did a raffle for a exclusive Cemetery Confessions tote bag. One of the Patreon members won that. So you can get that kind of stuff. You can get other rewards. And of course, our patrons are the ones that are keeping this show on the internet and continuing to produce interesting content. So you can check that out by heading over to patreon.com/cemeteryconfessions. In 2 weeks, we will return. We're going to be having a more chatty episode. A friend of mine and YouTuber from Stockholm, Sweden, is going to be coming on to chat with us about goth music and its relevance to goth culture and identity formation. We're going to be covering that in detail. And the episode after that, if you're into interviews with like this one, where we're chatting with people in the music industry, we will be having a conversation with Charlotte of the band Nox Novacula. So subscribe, come back, hang out with us in a couple weeks. And if you feel so inclined, check us out on Patreon. That's it for us. Thanks again for listening. And until next time, stay dark.
The preceding program is a member of the Belfry, a network of blogs, podcasts, and videos for the darkly inclined. Go to thebelfry.rip for more information.